In the fall of 2015, I became the first transgender athlete to compete for any Division I men's college team. My story went viral as a result, in the news and in the media, and I made a very conscious decision to be open about my journey, to share myself. Because as a kid, I never saw people like me in the media, and more importantly, in athletics. And I wanted kids like me to see somebody like them in media, in athletics.
These words come from retired Harvard University swimmer Skylar Baylor during his 2018 TEDx talk, in which he described his emotional journey coming out as transgender to his friends, his teammates, his grandma, and the world. Baylor's journey has been followed and met with praise within the swimming and trans communities, as well as from people all across the United States. With sports so ingrained into our culture, Skylar Baylor's story not only demonstrates the complex relations between sport and athletes, but also how institutions like athletics have the power to regulate the standards and norms that have come from a history of white settler colonialism that are harmful for all. Following his story, I'm going to talk about how these standards of normativity came to be and how they remain in force today. Specifically, I'm going to be using a combination of the work of punishment theorist Michel Foucault alongside native feminist theorists Miley Arvin, Eve Tuck, and Angie Morrill to analyze the ways in which sport serves as an extension of carcerality to police the sex and gender binary. As we're about to dive into a lot in just a short little video, I think it's important to note that there is so much writing and advocacy work out there surrounding penal and carceral practices, oppressive standards, athletics, all of it, which I encourage you all to continue looking into. It is also important to acknowledge that I am a white cisgender female who is still in the process of figuring out my role in the fight towards dismantling systems of oppression. My name is Taylor Pinen, and I compete as a collegiate athlete on a swim team, much like Skylar Baylor. I'm going to share parts of his story, not to claim that I fully understand his experiences or that I even know about being a trans person of color, especially in athletics. Instead, I hope to center his story because he generously offers it to those of us who want to learn from his experience and work together to change the oppressive systems we find ourselves in. This is intended to honor, make space for, center, and follow those who are most marginalized by settler colonialism and white supremacy, and also to bring this conversation into my own spaces in the institutions that I call home. Because as community, it is crucial that we are continuously engaged in disrupting and questioning our even most cherished institutions when we discover the ways in which they uphold white supremacy. There are numerous norms and constructs that come from a history of violence that remain relevant today. As many of us are learning about how race is a social construct that was created to justify violence during colonization, it's important that we recognize that the constructs of sex and gender were deeply intertwined with this process. In the US, our dominant society often thinks of the male-female sex and gender binary as normal and natural. However, the history behind these constructs show us otherwise. The notions of the binary became solidified by white society at the start of colonization. Many indigenous and African cultures did not share traditional European ideologies of sex and gender, as their societies were often matriarchal and gender fluid and/or intersex people were accepted and acknowledged. White Europeans, however, looked at indigenous and African cultures and people as inferior and savage, and as threats to white ways of life. In face of these threats, colonizers justified violence against those who deviated from what was considered normal. In order to justify this racialized violence and gendered violence, various white institutions worked to validate their own notions of truth. Among the fields they co-opted to validate their conceptions of sex and gender is the field of science. Western scientists conclude that there are numerous factors that make up a person's assigned sex, such as one's internal genitalia, external genitalia, and hormones. But it is hard to measure one's sex because people don't fit into the categories that Western science has constructed, especially as our categories are based on this male-female binary. As this categorization has been challenged to incorporate intersex and trans people, our system is still based upon this notion that the sex binary is biological, natural, and normal. Further, since our categories are so intertwined with relations of power, it is unclear that the whole notion of sex is a meaningful way to categorize people. We struggle to break out of the sex and gender binary because all sorts of institutions, both formal and informal, have been born to maintain this ideology. So, this brings us to sports. In the US, women's and men's sports are kept separate with the justifications that men and women have different innate athletic capabilities, that the two genders are easily identifiable, and that justice demands that we maintain an equal playing ground by protecting space for our female athletes to compete. However, there are numerous variables that contribute to competitive advantages in sport that go beyond the sex and gender binary, and these are too often disregarded. And unlike testing on doping among athletes, measuring one's gender or sex is ambiguous. But under the guise of fairness, the sex and gender binaries were employed and regulated at the advent of women's participation in sport. As women have been participating in sport throughout the past centuries, in 1948, the International Association of Athletics Federations, in the name of fairness, created legislation for an official sex verification process. To prove their gender and therefore their eligibility, this required female athletes to provide medical certificates. This is just one of the many tests that athletes have had to comply with in order to prove their sex and gender. And the history of these tests is based on discriminatory ideas pertaining to gendered and racist stereotypes about what men and women should look like. And it forced athletes into a male-female sex and gender binary. Testing continues today, and it's based primarily on hormones, specifically testosterone. Many athletes, however, do not fit the gender confines defined by white scientific and athletics institutions. Athletes competing in the women's category have been forced to comply to invasive sex verification testing and efforts to level the competition and ensure that they are meeting white requirements of womanhood, which are tied to weakness. Though sex and gender regulations and testing practices have changed for various reasons, such as privacy concerns, the essence of requiring athletes to prove woman or manhood through ambiguous tests in order to compete still exists today. Ultimately, people outside of the sex and gender binaries who don't meet the standards created by white sports federations are being erased or barred from competing in sports. This focus on how athletics conceptualizes sex and gender is important, but now I'm going to look into how athletics enforces these constructs. White norms and constructs have been maintained through formal laws and regulations, but also through our everyday structures and institutions that function as subliminal enforcers of normativity. Athletics is one of the more powerful of these institutions, given how many people watch and follow sports. The strict separation of the two sexes, male and female, in both formal and informal sporting events models ideals of normativity for us all. This ultimately works to maintain the notion of sex and gender categorizations and the power dynamics that they were constructed through. Skylar Baylor's story helps us see that this segregation by sex is neither simple nor necessary. He has shared that he spent much of his childhood trying to be somebody he wasn't. He went through years of self-policing in order to conform to society's expectations and norms. This made him feel trapped and miserable. Baylor's actions and experiences represent the lengths of regulations that people put themselves through in order to meet society's requirements of normativity. Baylor indicates that many of his actions were self-imposed. And applying a Foucauldian lens to his story can help us see that this self-policing is a result of a structure of white norms and constructs that have been baked into the carceral society that we all internalize. Michel Foucault is regarded as one of the most prominent figures in pedagogies of the carceral state. He uses the explanation of Bentham's panopticon in his book Discipline and Punish, and he explains the ways in which state power is used to implement intense societal surveillance that leads people to ultimately conform to regulations on their own and eventually self-police. Societies can employ many strategies of surveillance, such as promoting depictions of normality in a way that depicts abnormalities as wrong or even dangerous. Foucault explains that, quote, "the judges of normality are present everywhere," close quote. When we examine our institutions, we find that many of them engage in the policing of the sex and gender binary. Athletics is no exception. It's important to note that human categorizations are not inherently bad, as they can help us make sense of the world, but they can be solidified under goals of domination and subordination. People within our carceral society are all subject to various white ideologies and norms, and we are all continuously shaped and controlled by the systems and the structures around us. This is why the story of Skylar Baylor is for us all. You might be wondering if I'm suggesting that sports and other institutions are doomed. That's not necessarily my point. Instead, I assert that it's important to start identifying the systems within our institutions so that we can build a collective understanding and movement towards dismantling the structures and the norms that oppress or marginalize people. A 2013 Native feminist theorist essay that's titled Decolonizing Feminism, Challenging Connections Between Settler Colonialism and Heteropatriarchy invites us all into this process. The essay critiques a different institution, college women's and gender studies programs. In this essay, Miley Arvin, Eve Tuck, and Angie Morrill identified 5 ways in which gender studies departments maintain and regulate systems of oppression. The authors also offer ways to overcome these challenges. I will share 2 of their challenges and recommendations, and will describe how they can help us build a base for understanding the challenges that are identified in sport. The first recommendation pertains to problematizing and theorizing the intersections of white Western ideologies into our institutions. In high school, Skylar Baylor was recruited to swim at Harvard University for the women's team. When Baylor came out as trans, the Harvard men's coach eventually offered him a spot on the men's team. Baylor underwent top surgery and hormone therapy, which made him ineligible for women's competition, and he chose to swim for the men's team. His gender affirmation and transition process worked for him, and it also allowed him to fit within the NCAA guidelines for competition, or a white definition of manhood. However, for many athletes, their own gender transition or affirmation process is met with restrictions from sport. This ultimately erases many people from participation. Arvin, Tuck, and Morrill suggest that we need to actively examine the ways in which white constructs are bound up into our institutions, like athletics. This is a very complicated process, as Western society has so fully accepted and incorporated the idea of the sex and gender binary that many find it difficult to imagine an athletics governing system that is fair if it does not protect the female athletes from the male athletes. Arvin, Tuck, and Morrill suggest that these difficulties are precisely what we should be investigating. The second and final challenge that I'm going to be talking about from the Native feminist theorists relate to our actions moving forward. The theorists explain the goals of refusing erasure of marginalized identities within systems, and also remaining critical about the implications of inclusion. Calls for inclusion are often used as ways for institutions to mitigate criticisms rather than to transform relations of power. Today, we're hearing a lot of campaigns from athletics institutions surrounding diversity and inclusion. This is important, but we must remain committed to an ongoing practice of examining what we're doing and the implications of our actions. For Skylar Baylor, it was crucial that he felt safe and welcome on his team. The same applies for all athletes, especially those who have been marginalized. However, many current policies within sports solely focus on survival within this existing framework of hierarchy, and not a framework that moves us towards dismantling oppressive structures in the first place. The most prominent example of gender-inclusive policies and practices within the United States is the application of Title IX to athletics institutions. Though the original policy was never explicitly intended to include athletics institutions, Title IX was applied to sport as a result of advocacy and lobbying efforts in the name of women's rights and inclusion. Overall, despite the increase in sports participation amongst women, the essence of Title IX inclusion still relies on and upholds the sex and gender binary. This continues to erase or leave people out of participation. Various athletics institutions have tried to deal with this by creating gender-inclusive protocols and best practices. For example, in 2011, under the precedent of gender inclusiveness, the NCAA Office of Inclusion created guidelines surrounding best practices in supporting transgender student athletes. Though the office states its desires to create an inclusive and safe environment, the guidelines still function within an institution that was built on maintaining a sex and gender binary. So with all of this, we have a lot to discuss and deconstruct so that we can strive towards a liberated world for all, away from oppressive standards and ideologies. And maybe there isn't one single answer, but due to the COVID-19 pandemic today, athletics institutions are having to make drastic decisions. For example, as many college institutions and athletics programs are facing financial constraints, the NCAA has already requested Title IX waivers. And while this could have serious effects on the existence of women's programs, in this time of deciding on new normals, it is possible that the normal in which institutions are striving to regain and recreate is not the normal in which we need. Also, today, 25 states are proposing regulations and even banning trans women from participating in women's sports as a means to keep women's sports safe. It is time that we start questioning the essence of institutions like athletics and listening to various people who have been calling for change for decades. This includes Skylar Baylor, who remains vocal on his social media platforms and also in his work with various sport federations. With the pandemic forcing the country to pause and reflect on what is, the time is now to start listening. To start listening as a means to continue questioning the history of oppressive ideologies under the guise of fairness, and start talking about taking that stroke towards a liberated world for all. Human categories can be helpful for our understanding of the world, but it's important that we are naming these conceptions and naming their history. The conceptions of the sex and gender binary are inextricably linked and were born out of fear and the desire to control. Identifying this will also allow us to see the ways in which sex and gender notions have been maintained. This can also open us up to avenues to disrupt the ways in which the categorizations and the binary are oppressive. I want to leave you with Baylor's words as an expression of this hope.
So whether you're the person who's in the water taking one more stroke, or you're the person in the stands, the parent, the teacher, the coach, the ally, the grandmother, you have to take one more stroke. And you have to keep taking one more stroke and one more stroke and one more stroke until you're sitting on the edge of your pool, watching your team warm down, having just had the best meal of your life with tears in your eyes, thinking this is the life that I want to live.